Kinesiology of the musculoskeletal system. Chapter 3, Muscle, Stabilizer and Mover of the Skeletal System. So our chapter overview, we're going to talk about the following. How muscles stabilize bones and generate force, including a review of histology and physiology and so forth. How muscles modulate and control forces, use of EMG. We're going to skip mechanisms of muscular fatigue and adaptation to muscle with exercise. So let's take a look at the structural organization of muscle. Just like around nerves, we have an epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. In the muscle, we have an epimysium, a perimysium, and an endomysium. So let's take a look at that briefly. In this picture, you can see that the whole muscle here, the tendon attaching to the bone, is enveloped in the epimysium. Okay? Epi meaning the outer cover. Then, when we get to the fascicle level, okay, here's the fascicle, we have our perimysium, peri meaning the middle or inside. Okay? And then finally, we get down to the fiber, muscle fiber, and that is enveloped here in the endomysium, or the innermost portion. So here's a cross-section of that, epimysium on the outside, perimysium surrounding each fascicle, and the endomysium surrounding each muscle fiber. All right, so when we get down to the muscle fiber, those are made up of what we call basically the engine of the muscle, and that's the sarcomere. So here's a sarcomere from here to here. But basically, remember, a sarcomere is the engine of the muscle. So each individual muscle fiber is an individual cell with multiple nuclei. They range from 1 to 50 centimeters in length, and the fundamental unit is the sarcomere. So here's a picture of our sarcomere again. I'm going to break that down. We have our contractile elements here. We have our thin myofilaments, which is our actin, and our thick myofilaments, which is our myosin. So here's our myosin fiber, or our myosin structure in the middle, and our actin is the purple here. The myosin has these little arms that row on the actin to create a muscular contraction. So you can see here, this is in a relaxed state. All right. So the arms of the myosin are ready to pull on the myofilament actin. So here in a contracted state, you can see that those two are pulled together. So the M line is right here. We see the width here, and when a muscle contraction takes place, it pulls these together. Right? Moving forward further information about the sarcomere. So again, we have our actin and our myosin. We have the M line here. H zone is the portion of the sarcomere where the actin do not overlap, and of course when there's a contraction, this H zone here will get smaller. All right, so here's our myosin again, our cross bridges, and we have a couple of non-contractile proteins I want to just point out quick. These are titin here, which link the myosin to the ends here. Okay, we also have desmin, which is also a non-contractile protein. It gives structure to the edges where the actin molecules attach at this line. So the I band is the space between where there is no overlap of the myosin strands. Okay. And then here we have a representation of the muscle in a relaxed state, a partially contracted state, and a fully or maximally contracted state. You can see those are really close together. These are a little closer together, and this is in a relaxed state. Okay? So recall that in a relaxed state, in the midpoint of the muscle, the length tension relationship of these molecules is optimal. All right, so they can create generally the most force in that middle range. When it's fully contracted or stretched out, doesn't show a picture of that, but if they're fully contracted or fully stretched out, then the efficiency of those units goes way down, and we can contract at a much lower rate. All right, so just like there are many types of joints, there are different types of muscles as far as morphology. Many types, and they influence the total force that the muscle can exert. Force is related to the physiologic cross-section of muscle and its pennation angle. The pennation angle is essentially the angle at which the muscle fibers lie in relation to the central tendon. So if we have a strict fusiform muscle like this, you can see that the tendon here and the muscle are perfectly lined up. That will maximize force. Okay? However, when we get over here to unipennate or bipennate muscle, you can see that those are angled into the tendon. Now, what that means is that it can produce less force, as we'll see. However, the structure of the muscle allows more density of motor fibers and leads to actually a stronger contraction. So, maximum force potential is the sum of the cross-section area of all muscles. That makes sense. We talked about the fusiform running absolutely parallel. We talked about pennation angle a little bit. In human muscle, that pennation angle ranges between 0 and 30 degrees. At 30 degrees, about 86% of the total force of that muscle fiber contraction is then exerted upon the tendon to do work. With pennation, greater muscle force, maximum force, can be achieved because that pennation angle allows more fibers to be fit into a given area, which increases the overall cross-section area of the muscle in excess of the 14% loss of strength due to the angle. The cross-section is greater than that, and therefore there is the potential for a higher degree of maximum contraction. So for example, the gastrocnemius muscle in the back of the calf, in addition to being a type 2 lever, which really helps to create a lot of muscle force with relatively little contraction, the gastrocnemius is a multipennate muscle. So that multipennatity, if you will, allows a great number of muscle fibers in cross-section. So that muscle requires a lot of force to do functional work, and indeed it is a multipennate muscle which allows for a great deal of force. So force generation can be exerted on a tendon in a couple ways, one through passive tension, one through active contraction. So we're going to talk about passive tension first. Passive tension relies on the serial and parallel elastic components of the muscle. Once slack is taken up on muscle, passive tension muscle acts like a rubber band. Okay, so the more you stretch the rubber band, the more tension there is in the structure. When there's a slight to moderate stretch imposed, titin, okay, our non-contractile protein, is most responsible for this passive tension. When there's a more extensive stretch put on it, the extracellular connective tissues, mostly in the tendon, are responsible for that passive tension. So with slight to moderate, muscle is responsible, the non-contractile proteins. Remember that contractile proteins, the actin and myosin complex, do not have contractile, I should say elastic characteristics. They cannot stretch. It's the extracellular connective tissue and the titin and desmin in the muscle that's responsible. Passive tension, creating force generation, is most effective in the length and end range, which would involve what? The tendon or the muscle? The tendon. So that may protect the muscle from damage at the end range. So if we place a pretty decent amount of tension on a muscle and contract it from that lengthened position, if there's not this passive tension to help us bring it back, we may overstrain the contractile proteins. So passive tension is stored energy, which contributes to the force of the following muscle contraction. It is in the elastic range, not in the plastic range, not in the toe range. It's in the elastic range towards the end due to viscoelasticity. We remember that. The example being honey. Okay, so the longer it's held, the more it's stretched. And it also, this passive tension increases with velocity. So if our arm, if we fall and we catch the rail or something with our arm, that velocity is much higher and tension will increase much more rapidly than with a slow stretch. Active length tension. Maximum active force capacity is generally at the resting length. I want you to take a look at figures 3.1 and 3.11. And those deal with force changes due to length. And note that active and passive insufficiency can be in play here. So when we look at figure 3.10 or 3.10, you see that the length of the sarcomere has a great deal of effect on the ability to create muscle force through tension. So when we look at points B and C, where the sarcomere is at approximately 2 to 3 micrometer length, the amount of active tension is the greatest. But when it's short or when it's long, there's relatively little tension. As passive tension increases, it becomes dominant. So if we look at figure 3.11 on the right, you see again that the resting length is in the middle and has the greatest amount of active force. But as the increased length of the resting muscle increases to the right, passive tension, the purple line, skyrockets. So that as the length increases towards end range, most of it is actually in passive tension. This is particularly important in two joint muscles such as the gastrocnemius and the rectus femoris. All right, so isometric muscle force. The length tension curve of a muscle is variable. It's not the same in every one. So some muscles is in absolutely the middle of the range, where others are towards actually the end of one of the ranges. We're going to see that in just a minute. The muscle force isometrically is, or at least the amount that it can produce, is generally dependent on muscle length and moment arm. So therefore, for a given muscle force, the longer the moment arm, the more the force in general. Okay? The longer the moment arm, the more the force. So if we hold a 5-pound weight in our hand, that's going to create more force in the muscle isometrically in the biceps than if we have a 5-pound cuff weight just above the wrist. The length retention curve in real life is largely dependent on functional demands. So take a look at figure 3.12, and you can see in figure 3.12 the length tension curve on the left of the biceps and on the right for the hip abductors. So if you don't have your book yet, this one is the length tension curve very similar to what the biceps look like. So at 90 degrees, it's at the greatest. And we'll talk about why in a minute. It relates to function. Okay, so in an upright posture, if we stand and we bend our elbow to 90 degrees, that creates the greatest length of the moment arm. Okay, so it would make sense then that we use that muscle in that position. We use our hands quite a bit at that 90-degree position. But at the hip abductors, the length tension relationship looks very different. In fact, the greatest amount of torque production for the hip abductor occurs at minus 10 degrees of hip abduction. In other words, 10 degrees of hip adduction, pushing into an abducted position. Why do you think this is? I want you to think about that for a minute. And I'll just show you, here's the curve. All right, minus 10, and it goes down. So this is minus 10 to 40 degrees of abduction. So there's relatively little force production here at end range, hip abduction, where the greatest amount is at minus 10 degrees. Why do you think that is? The reason is that when we walk, our hip abductor muscle keeps us from dropping our pelvis on the contralateral side. So when we're in mid-stance phase of gait, our left hemipelvis will drop towards the ground or towards the floor if the hip abductor muscle does not stabilize, right? So we walk all the time. It's our mode of transportation. Therefore, when we walk, of course, our hip drops into a little bit of adduction moment, which then correlates to this minus 10 degree position. So functionally, the muscle is working all the time in that position, not so much when it's way out at 40 degrees. So specificity of training shows itself both with the abductor muscle and with the biceps. Now we can take advantage of this for strength testing, especially if you're not a very big therapist. So if we have a big strong guy lying on his left side, let's say, and we have a small female therapist, or we can say a male therapist, trying to do the muscle test, if they're very strong, we try to test them at, let's say, 0 or 5 degrees of hip abduction, their force production is going to be quite high. It's going to be way up here. However, if we bring them out to, let's say, 30 degrees, then we don't have to work as hard, and maybe they don't overpower us, right? So we can test the uninvolved side first in a 30-degree position, because maybe we can break them and get a good sense of how much strength they have, and then flip them on the uninvolved side and test the involved leg, and test them here again at 30 degrees, right? And we can maybe detect whether there's a difference in muscle strength, where if we test it way up here in a abducted position, they may be so strong that you're unable to differentiate where there's a strength issue, okay? So remember, we talked about back in the last one, testing muscles, and perhaps you talked about it in test and measures. If this is the elbow flexor length tension curve, and this is at full elbow extension at 0 degrees, and this is at full elbow flexion, 135. If we test them here at 130 degrees, we might be able to pick up subtle strength differences that relate to nerve root involvement, okay? So that's C6 myotone. So if I hold it at end range and carefully place my force through the muscle, I might be able to appreciate a slight difference for people that have something like cervical radiculopathy, okay? Where we couldn't test it because we wouldn't be able to feel it or notice it in the resting length because the muscle is just very, very strong. So sometimes we can take advantage of that isometric force production length tension curve of a muscle if we know what it is. Okay, so there's the hip abductor. All right, figure 3.14. This is the concentric eccentric activation curve. force velocity curve. So for the concentric muscle contraction, higher velocities are possible with lower loads, and with concentric, the higher the load, the lower the velocity. So that makes sense. You can't push a heavy load very fast, especially if you're getting toward the upper ranges of your capacity, where the highest velocity is possible with very low loads. Eccentrically, it's a little bit different. With the lowest loads, high velocity is not possible. I want you to try this on yourself right now. So if you take your elbow in a sitting or a standing position, flex it to 90 degrees with your elbow to your side, flex your elbow, bring your wrist up, see how quickly you can lower your elbow using your biceps without kicking in the triceps. Give it a shot. You can't do it very quickly. If you kick in the triceps, then of course you can. Then when you get towards the end of the range, your biceps has to really put on the brakes. But see how fast you can lower that using only the biceps. High velocity is not possible. However, with high loads, okay, so let's say your 1 RM or your 1 rep max is 80 pounds for a bicep curl, right? So if you take it to the end range concentrically, you can achieve quite high velocities in an eccentric pattern, lowering that bicep or the weight to back to 0 degrees of the elbow. So it's a little bit different. All right, so here's where it comes in with force production. All right, so here's our force velocity curve. This is using an isokinetic dynamometer. And I'm going to move this out of the way. Here, this is maximum force capacity. All right, so at high velocity, shortening muscle contraction, concentric, we can produce only a little bit of force, okay? So if you think about maybe flexing and extending your elbow or internally, externally rotating your shoulder, if we do it at, let's say, 500 degrees per second, which is pretty fast, we're only going to be able to produce a certain amount of muscle force maximally. But as we slow down, we can create more and more force, okay? So in fact, the very slowest, okay, the very slowest shortening velocity concentrically can produce about this much force, theoretically. Isometrically, we can produce a little more. And eccentrically, our maximum force capacity is higher. And remember, as velocity increases, we talked about before, the amount of tension in the muscle increases, and that tension relates to load. So way up here, fast eccentrics, slow eccentrics, isometrics, slow concentrics, fast concentrics. Fast on the outside, slow in the middle, I should say towards the middle, and isometric in the middle. Force capacity and tension within the muscle itself. So there's your curve. All right. Okay, so power is work, which is a combination of force and velocity. So a concentric muscle contraction is positive work. So when we go up the stairs, the quadricep muscle is working to concentrically contract to bring ourselves up the stairs along with some other muscles, but that's positive quadricep work. When we go down the stairs, we're doing eccentric muscle contraction. It's still work, but it's negative work. So quadriceps going downstairs is work. We maintain power by increasing our load or decreasing our speed. So if you think about somebody going up a mountain on a bicycle, okay, cyclists. Let's say they're at gear number 4, fourth gear, and they're climbing the mountain at a specific speed. All right, remember, it's force times velocity. So if we are going uphill using our 4th gear, then we're producing a certain amount of force, or I should say a certain amount of power or work. When we drop a gear down to, let's say, second gear, which we can do more spinning, okay, power is going to be the same if we maintain the speed going uphill while our velocity increases as we pedal faster. Okay, so our velocity increases and our force decreases, and therefore our power stays the same. Okay, so muscles are obviously activated by the nervous system, so we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of neural activation. Muscles are activated by alpha motor neurons, and those alpha motor neurons can be triggered in a couple of different ways. First is through direct efferent input from cortical descending pathways. So if I volitionally decide to bend my elbow in a standing position, it's coming from the premotor cortex and then the motor cortex. I plant it in the pre, I execute it in the motor cortex. I flex my elbow. However, you can also get excitation of the alpha motor neurons by spinal interneurons and sensory afferent influence. Okay, so those are both reliant. The alpha motor neuron activation is reliant on sensory cues from the periphery. So, for example, if I was holding something in my hand and then I was looking away to the side and somebody put another load on the same hand, I would not have to think about that. I would use my spinal interneurons and that sensory afferent influence to quickly adjust my load in my biceps or the force production of my biceps to maintain that muscle position. Okay? So muscles are recruited at the motor unit via an action potential. That stimulation is at the motor end plate of the neuromuscular junction. We saw something like this before. Here's our picture with our synaptic terminal here. Acetylcholine is released, depolarization of the muscle cell goes down endoplasmic reticulum, sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that innervates, releases calcium and innervates a muscle contraction. Okay, moving on. Muscle fiber unit force is governed by what we call rate coding, which is the speed at which it fires. So initial activation of a muscle fiber is approximately 10 action potentials per second, and what we call hertz, Hz, or frequency. Okay, 10 action potentials per second. As the muscle ramps up in strength or force production, it may briefly reach up to 50 hertz. Okay, 50 action potentials per second. The time between as the time between action potential decrease, the force increases. That's just another way of stating this. So unfused tetanus, okay, with unfused tetanus meaning the rate of firing here, it's not maximized. That means it's unfused. We use that in submaximal contraction for graded contraction. Fused tetanus of a muscle fiber is the maximum force generating state of that muscle fiber. So here we get a twitch, right? And then we get this ramping up to maximum tension. Now we can't hold that for that long. We get fatigue and the muscles lose tension despite that continued stimulus. So we want to hold it, and we can for a while, but then it peters out. And what happens? Other muscle fibers jump in to do the work unless the muscle is completely overloaded. So that's why at a certain force, we can hold an isometric contraction for pretty much an unlimited amount of time. Because we get muscle fibers contracting, they fatigue, but then other muscle fibers cycle in to pick up the slack, and it cycles like that. So muscles get tired, others come in, others get replenished, and come back up and create the contraction again. When we're towards the end of our capacity, however, that failure cannot be overcome through cycling because the muscles just don't have time to replenish and create enough force. All right? So fused tetanus, again, is the maximum contraction of a muscle. Okay, so motor unit characteristics. When we talk about motor unit characteristics, we're talking about ratios, innervation ratios of a particular muscle. So that's the number of muscle fibers innervated per axon, okay? So high ratios are found in gross movement muscles like the quadriceps and, the anterior tibialis perhaps. So high ratios, in other words, one axon is going to innervate many muscle fibers for power, for speed, and so forth, okay? High force muscles. Low ratios, in other words, low numbers of muscle fibers innervated by a particular axon, are found in fine motor, low force muscles, okay? Like the hand, the intrinsic muscles of the hand. We don't need necessarily a high amount of force all the time. We rely more on very carefully planned fine motor control. So each axon innervates between 5 and 2,000 muscle fibers, okay? So those that produce the highest amount of force have high ratios towards the 2,000 side, and those that produce the lowest are found in the low ratio muscles towards the 5. That kind of makes sense because if we have an axon that innervates 1,500 muscle fibers, its force capacity is going to be much greater than an axon that creates an action potential with 100 muscle fibers, right? This we've seen before. Figure 3.19. We talked about this in exercise physiology last semester. So we have type 1 muscle fiber, type 2A, and type 2B, which we call type 2X. Okay? And in fact, the book also refers to that as type 2X. But probably a more important way to think about it is that this one here is our type 1 is our slow oxidative, our fast oxidative glycolytic, and our fast glycolytic. So this is red, if you remember, because it's got a high number of mitochondria. All right. This is pink, and this is white. So not so much blood flow, very low mitochondria here. Red, red, red. Postural muscles, low innervation ratio, as it says here. Type 1, slow oxidative, low innervation ratio. Fast oxidative glycolytic is our medium. That's the hybrid muscle, right? It can produce force and it can help with endurance, but it's not one or the other. It's kind of a mix. Medium ratio, not ration. Sorry. Medium ratio. Then our fast glycolytics, that's high innervation ratio. They're white fibers, low mitochondria. Resistance to fatigue is low, right? Anaerobic. Up here, aerobic, because it's red. Contraction speed for our fast glycolytic is high. For our slow oxidative, low innervation, it's low. So I want you to know this chart. You really have to understand it. Don't try to memorize it. Try to understand why it is, okay? Force per cross-sectional area in our type 2X is high, right? Pretty high for our fast oxidative glycolytic and low for our slow oxidative. And then our myoglobin content, which relates to the redness of the muscle and the number of mitochondria, is high for our slow oxidative and low for our fast glycolytic and for our fast oxidative glycolytic. So that's low. So understand and know this chart. The recruitment order of a muscle, given muscle, is in red here. So our slow oxidative muscle fibers are activated first. Okay, remember, low contraction speed, low force. So it's important to understand that even though our fast muscles, like the biceps, biceps brachii, that's a fast muscle. However, it does have some fiber types that are slow oxidative. So when it's first activated, we get our slow oxidative. And as activation increases and that recruitment increase, the rate of the firing increase as we go from twitch to unfused tetanus to high tetanus. That's the order that occurs in slow oxidative to fast oxidative glycolytic to fast glycolytic. Okay, and this is what we call the Henneman size principle. All right, that has to do with recruitment order. It allows for a smooth, controlled escalation of motor activation. Okay. Muscle fatigue, this is just a review. We talked about this last semester. Peripheral fatigue is related to the muscle and the tissues around it itself. So we get reduced excitability and sensitivity of the muscle, the motor unit. We have reduced calcium and energy sources. We get slower cross-bridging during the cycling of muscle contraction. We get reduced blood flow, which is what? Ischemia. And we have lactic acid accumulation. So those are peripheral mechanisms for fatigue. As opposed to central. Central, there's reduced excitability to our supraspinal levels. Okay? And that deals with a perception of effort and our willingness to suffer primarily. Remember that? So willingness to suffer deals with why some people can produce muscle strength gains in weightlifting and others cannot, because their willingness to push, their willingness to suffer is higher than those that shut down when they have a perception of increased effort. So those are central and peripheral mechanisms of muscle fatigue. All right, building up and tearing down. We talked about this in exercise physiology last semester. Don't forget, specificity is important. Okay, if we do muscle training in the aerobic range where we're dealing mostly with endurance, that's what we're going to increase. We're going to increase endurance. We already saw the muscle's force tension curve is different depending on specificity or where we use that muscle the most. So remember, we get neural adaptation of muscle first. We don't get increase in muscle fiber size until at least 6 weeks. All right, so with this text, they talk about high and low resistance training defined by this. Low, at least 15 reps to fatigue. Okay, low resistance training for endurance is at least 15 reps, where high they define as 3 to 12. But remember, this is a continuum. So if we're doing 3 and our rep max then is 3, we're going to failure quickly. That's pure power. 2x muscle fibers, right? And as we go from 3 to 6, we're still in the high range, but we're starting to use some of our different muscles, maybe our 2A, right? And then as we get to 12 to 15, we have a mix of things. If we do like 40 repetitions until failure, then we're really working our type 1 muscles, right? That should make sense to you. Recall that eccentric muscle contraction is more likely to result in muscle hypertrophy. And why is that? Do you recall? The reason is the eccentric muscle contraction at a given load, let's say 50 pounds of bicep curl. During concentric contraction, we use more motor fibers than we do with eccentric. So at a given amount of force, we use fewer fibers, which means they work harder, which means we are more likely to get hypertrophy. Okay? Hypertrophy comes from an increase in cross-sectional area. About 95% of our hypertrophy comes from that. Maybe 5%, depending on the author you're talking about, is actually through some form of hyperplasia, which is an increase in actual number of motor fibers. Okay? And we talked about before, neural comes first, and that's through increased supraspinal motor drive. Okay? So as we lift weights and we work on improving our strength, our neural system is able to adapt and handle more load. before we get actually an increase in muscle fiber size. Okay, so response to detraining and mobilization. When we're immobilized, we atrophy our muscles at a rate of approximately 3 to 6% per day, and by 40 days, a maximum of 40%. That's a lot of loss of muscle size, right? Our cross-sectional area during detraining and immobilization is different than our total strength loss. So if we lose 20% of our cross-sectional muscle size, we get approximately a 40% loss of strength. And why is that? Well, total cross-sectional area supposedly equals amount of maximum motor force generation. However, because it's 40%, we know there's a neural component. So our supraspinal neural drive goes down. Okay, so that's why 20% loss of cross-sectional area, increased muscle loss of strength at 40% because there's a neural factor. Recall that postural muscles and slow muscles atrophy faster. Postural and slow atrophy selectively more rapidly than our phasic and fast twitch muscle fibers. And remember that in a shortened position of the muscle, there's more atrophy. So a good example is a Achilles rupture. So if we cast them in 15 degrees of plantar flexion, they're going to atrophy more than if we cast them at a neutral 0 degree position. All right, last slide. Effects of aging on muscle. This is nothing new. We get a greater loss of power than of peak force, right? So power is what? It's force times velocity. So we might be able to create more force, but our ability to do that at a high velocity decreases at a more rapid rate than total peak strength as we age. Our old friend sarcopenia is flesh poverty, remember? Training, we can strength train our active, healthy adults, our elderly folks. They'll slow down flesh poverty, but it will not stop it. And type 2 muscle fibers selectively atrophy with sarcopenia. That's different than immobilization, where type 1 are selectively atrophied first. With sarcopenia, our type 2 fibers go first. Now that's interesting because those are faster twitch muscles, and that may relate to our difficulty with our elderly population in balance because we need our faster twitch muscles to perform quick, fine-tuned balance responses in response to a perturbation. So peak strength starts to decline at the age of 60 and absolutely accelerates after the age of 75. And why is knowing about sarcopenia important and how does it get there? This is why it's important that our patients understand why exercise is so vital. Sarcopenia leads to less muscle mass, which leads to a sensation of increased effort. Okay, that deals with what? Our central fatigue mechanism, all right, which causes us to naturally perform fewer physical activities, which leads to atrophy, lower muscle mass, which leads to increased sarcopenia. So our folks that are at 60 years old or so should be encouraged to do some form of muscle training. And a good way to do that, if they don't want to go to the gym, which most of them won't, is to do things like practicing going from sitting to standing and standing to sitting, and practicing going up and down stairs and doing calf raises and things of that nature. Lower extremity, very important for our balance response. So we'll see you next time in Chapter 4. Thanks so much.